Hi everyone and welcome to my LoD Wave of Light Monk Guide for Season 24. So this has become the kind of surprise last minute winner of the patch. In the final patch notes we have seen a massive buff to the Rabid Strike Monk Fist Weapon that gives the build a roughly 11 tiers boost in damage. And this makes it so that this has actually become the strongest build in the game, even surpassing Firebird Wizard. So there is no doubt that this is gonna do quite easily 150 solo next season with the Ethereal bonuses, and even without the Ethereals it's gonna remain probably the best or second best build in the game. That's just how strong it is. At the start of the PTR this was extremely strong already, and then it got hammered by nerfing some of the key items for the build, and in the final patch notes, to the surprise of probably most people, we have seen this insane buff now. The main idea behind the build is quite simple. So you have Legacy of Dreams, you stack a bunch of random items plus a few key items that support this build, and you have the Rabid Strike clone that will mimic your attacks when you have Epiphany active. So you go for 100% uptime with Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac and some cooldown reduction. That is quite easy to achieve, and this clone will deal all the damage for you. All you need to do is applying Cyclone Strike to enemies, because this gives you a damage bonus and also a damage reduction, and make sure you have permanent Epiphany. And the rest is small things to optimize your DPS. There's basically no doubt that this build will dominate Season 24. There will be a speed meta with the bell runs using two of those monks. There will be easy 150 solo clears. There will probably be even people trying this in 150 4-man. Even though there are better options with the Witch Doctor and the Necromancer, this is definitely a build that we will see, I think, because people will have it geared from all those speedruns. So it can do everything really nicely. It is actually the best T16 build and one of the best bounty builds in the game too. So it kind of does it all. And let's jump into the setup here. So this is how the setup looks. We have a Legacy of Dreams, and this is the solo push version right now, but we have more here that we can open in the free planner, so if you want to check those out. But let's go over the key items. We have the Pinto's Bright Bracer. This one gives you Wave of Light, extra damage, 150%, and a slow that is applied before the damage is done, so you don't lose any value in case you have something like Bench Trapped in speedruns, for example. That is really neat. We have the Kiroshiro Blade, which gives you again damage multiplier for Wave of Light, and even more damage when you hit only few targets. So this is extremely nice because this allows you to deal pretty decent damage when density thins out a bit. Then we have the Rabid Strike, which right now we have on the Ethereal. So in Season 24 you can get Ethereals that have legendary weapon power. In this case you see here on the bottom, Spirit Spenders that teleport you while Epiphany is active are also mimicked. And this one gets the huge buff in the patch, which is not shown here, because this one also says with 450% increased damage. So this is a times 5.5 multiplier, because pretty much all the damage is coming from that clone. So your own damage is pretty much irrelevant. It's like 1 or 2% of the total. Next we have the Bindings of the Lesser Gods. This item was buffed for the purpose of the inner rework, but it also has a side effect that it affects the Rabid Strike clone. So for this item and also the Crutus Boots that also got buffed, we have an extra damage multiplier, because this Rabid Strike clone counts as a Mystic Ally for those two items. But it does not count as a Mystic Ally for Mystic Ally damage rolls on your items, for example the chest and the shoulders. So you don't want to roll this stat, but the two legendary items actually do work. So both of these give you a ×3 multiplier each, but this Bindings of the Lesser Gods only works after you apply Cyclone Strike to the enemies. So this is what I mentioned at the beginning. You always want to have a Cyclone Strike going every few seconds to apply this. And it has the added benefit of applying Lefebvre's Soliloquy, which gives you 50% damage reduction and grouping up enemies for more area damage. Lastly, there is the Zogrin's Gaze, which is the Wave of Light helm. It has a 150% additive damage bonus, so this is quite massive, and says Wave of Light is now cast at the enemy. Usually you cast it right in front of you, but with this you can actually cast it at a range, which doesn't really do all that much, because again most of the damage is coming from the clone, but it also prevents you from teleporting around with the Epiphany all the time, which especially in pushing and in speedruns where you kind of want to position yourself maybe in Oculus Ring or in a safe spot, is going to be very helpful. The remaining items are either damage buffs or damage reduction buffs. So for example, we have the Stone Gauntlets, which gives you 250% extra armor. The slow is completely negated by the permanent Epiphany uptime, so this is very good. We have Unity for more toughness. We have Convention of Elements for more DPS. It doesn't have to be this ring. You can also go with Stone Jordan, for example, especially in speedruns. And there's also Squirt's Necklace, because there's no other necklace to use. And occasionally you might be able to get 1, 2, maybe 3 stacks, or you might find a shield pattern that gives you a permanent 10 stacks. So that's also quite nice. What's important is the Zodiac ring in the cube. So theoretically you could wear this, but the stats are not great. But you need to have this for the Epiphany uptime, and also the instant storage of the Grand Temple in the weapon slot, because this gives you another massive bonus for Wave of Light. It's worth mentioning that this build can be played with both lightning and fire setups. So lightning looks a bit different. It produces a bell that stays for 3 seconds and it continuously electrocutes nearby enemies. It has a much smaller AoE but a bit more damage, so roughly 50% more DPS at the cost of area of effect. And it also is a bit more difficult to handle the resources with that, because on the fire version you could run a Cinder code, which makes the resource management much easier. So typically the fire setup is the preferred choice early on, especially also for speedruns, but later on for high-end pushing you can definitely go with lightning once you have optimized cooldown and resource cost reduction values, because you simply deal a bit more damage. The overall playstyle is the same, so nothing really changes, and the potential is also very similar. So we're talking about maybe a 1 tier difference or something like that. Here's an example of such a fire version, for example for speedruns. So it does a Cinder code, otherwise it's mostly unchanged. You can play around with a few pieces, as I mentioned, like the Stone Jordan here. You can also go with a St. Arjuice, for example, especially in speedruns. This is very helpful to keep up your squirts. And otherwise, not really that much changes here. You want to have your Legacy of Dreams anyway. You want to have your Enforcer, because the Mystic Ally is counted as a pet. So this is quite nice. And then you can have the Bane of the Trapped in speedruns, or the Bane of the Stricken when you're pushing. The best Ethereal to get for next season is the Jade Talon, because this one has an attack speed bonus that is really nice. So this gives you up to 30% more attack speed, and it has Spirit on Crit, which is a very unique stat that this weapon has. So this will help make the resource problems much easier. Essentially you're gonna get all your resources back like this, and you can easily play the lightning version without any trouble on season. On non-season without the Ethereals it will be a bit more complicated, but also manageable. There is also a second really good Ethereal, which is the Bartuk's Cutthroat, which will also be used a lot on the Monk. And this one has this consecutive hits increase damage by up to 100% effect. So this is essentially like a little Bane of the Stricken, and also extremely valuable because you can kill bosses and some leads really quickly. Here's also an example of a T16 setup, and also bounty versions work very similarly. In those setups you can actually run without the Rabid Strike, because you have way too much damage anyway. You don't need the Bindings of the Lesser Gods, you don't need really the crudest boots if you don't want, and you don't have to apply this Cyclone Strike all the time. So you forget all about this clone and you just deal damage with your own attacks, because in T16 this is more than fine, especially with your ethereal weapons. When you don't have a really strong setup early in the season, it might be worth going for the Rabid Strike, but later on you definitely won't need it anymore for those purposes. You can find all the defeat banners here in the description, so go check them out. We also have the max roll guide updated already for season 24 with everything you need to know about the build in the written format by Nofar. At this point I want to show you the LoD Wave of Light Monk in form and speed runs, because it's going to be one of the main speed runners next season. It's going to be very high up there, probably beating Rats, and just very slightly behind an optimized Firebird group, to the point where they do pretty much the same XP per hour. So it's going to be quite exciting. You're going to see a lot of monks, and here is some footage from the early PTR when we had this crazy LoD Wave of Light setup before it got hammered and now buffed again. So compared to what you're seeing here, the setup is I think around 2 tiers weaker, but you get the Ethereals in season 24. So even at much lower Paragon you're gonna do roughly these kind of runs here, and maybe if you're like earlier in the season, let's say a Paragon 1500, maybe 2k, 3k, you can definitely go way beyond 120. So 125 should be very achievable. The main thing here is that in these speedruns, the setup is kind of squishy, so you gotta be a bit careful about survival and also about your Squirt's Necklace. You have to try to protect your Squirt's Necklace and also your life with well-timed Serenity casts, for example, and this will definitely help you out. Here we've been running with a ZDH. It is also quite doable with third Monk, for example. So I made a video from early PTR as well showing the triple Monk setup. Essentially you have a support Monk because the ZDH doesn't really bring that many buffs to this setup because of the Sogun's Gaze that gives you 150% additive damage already. So you can definitely drop the DH and have a Monk in there that gives you all the toughness you'll need with Inner Sanctuary, with Mantras, and maybe Blind and all these kind of nice things. And it is definitely very doable. But for the end game, you want to go with the CDH anyway because you get more damage out of them. If you intend to play the LoD with Light Monk in groups in high tiers, you have to be a bit careful because of the Cyclone Strike requirement. Cyclone Strike will apply crowd control resistance to the enemies, and this makes grouping up enemies and keeping them in place very difficult for your Z-Barb. So the Z-Barb is usually the one who stomps and pulls stuff together with the so-called pixel pull. Then they rage flip enemies around to bring them closer and all this stuff. And essentially here you have to play much more around the Convention of Elements cycle and apply your Cyclone Strike only after the Z-Barb has already stomped or when you're about to die, because you want to refresh the Ephemeral Shoulders. So this is a bit tricky, and as I mentioned earlier, it is not really the best setup to do 150 with, but it can be used at least to go easily way beyond 140, maybe 145, even very early in the season without really a super optimized setup. So this is achievable, but it will be more clunky and more difficult than with other setups because of this Cyclone Strike that you have to use. In speedruns, all this crowd control stuff is not that important because there it's more about grouping enemies up and nuking them down, so you don't really need to be super precise with that. Just do a Cyclone Strike and make sure that you survive and you nuke properly, and that's it. There is one important thing though about the Rabid Strike clone, and that is something to really pay attention to optimize your damage, because sometimes you might not deal any damage whatsoever if you're not careful. And that is, sometimes the Mystic Ally clone will actually not teleport to you properly. So right now you can see that I am attacking here in this spot, but I am not doing any damage. If you remember, it's all coming from the clone who's here on the left, and on every attack he kind of like teleports around, as you can see here, to another position, to an enemy that is like nearby. And it can happen that this clone actually stays back quite far and will just attack somewhere into the wall or on like some random enemy far in the corner that is not affected by all your damage multipliers, by the Cyclone Strike and anything like this, and you will not deal any damage. So always take a look at the minimap and look for the purple dots and see if they're like far away. So you see your followers there, you see your Mystic Allies from the Cruel's Boots and from what you have on the bar, and you also see the clone that will pop up periodically as another purple dot. So when there's a purple dot far in the back and you notice you're not dealing any damage, you have to make sure that the clone teleports to you again. And he does that when you stop attacking for like a second or two. So always be careful about this, and also just look at the animations. You can theoretically just cast your wave of light somewhere a little bit to the side to make more clearly see where your clone is casting it. As long as you're not moving around very much, like when you're fighting one pull at a time and you move on, then nothing will really happen. But especially when you're moving quickly in speedruns or when you're going to a new position in a push or something like this, the clone might be dragging behind a little bit. And then you have to do this kind of like waiting for a second or two to make him catch up and teleport to you, and then next time you attack, he will be there. Lastly, you need to manage your Zodiac Ring procs properly. So this ring will reset one of your cooldowns by 1 second each time you attack, and most importantly, you don't want to autocast Epiphany whenever it's ready, because this will just waste Obsidian Ring procs and you could get away with probably 1 or 2 fewer cooldown rolls that could be, you know, something more valuable like area damage. So make sure you don't autocast Epiphany, but you only do it once every 15 seconds to not waste Obsidian Ring procs, and then you use Serenity whenever needed, and you also use Mystic Allies whenever needed, because this will restore 200 spirit for you, which almost fills your bar entirely. This is very nice, and this is also how you sustain, especially in the lightning setups, but also in the fire setups with Cinder Code. In large density, you can actually avoid pressing this Mystic Ally button a lot when you have the J-Talon Ethereal, or also the Shadow Killer Ethereal, which also has Spirit on crit. So if you have one of those, you will actually refill your Spirit quite a lot from their effects, and this will allow you to just pump Zodiac procs into Serenity and be almost entirely invincible. So that is very neat. Finally, it's worth noting that this build runs Enforcer, and this allows you to keep your follower alive kind of easily, because this 90% damage reduction applies to the follower when you have it equipped. So if you give your follower good items and perhaps even augment a few pieces and give them nice life per hit and life regen values, it is possible to keep them alive, especially in speedruns, but theoretically also in solo pushing, at least to some degree. And this allows you to run with either the cooldown relic or the all skill relic. So which follower you choose is kind of up to you. Also have the perks. Templar can be really nice for the healing. If you don't really have any life per hit rolls on your own items, this might be the way to go. Then there's a Scoundrel with the cooldown relic especially, who can give you this 100% crit effect every so often. That is very neat. And then there's also the Enchantress, which just has overall really solid bonuses in general. So you can choose any of them. I would recommend the Enchantress for like the most basic setups because of the cooldown, and then maybe later on you can swap it around, or you just go with Templar for the heals. And that's about it for this guide. So I hope you enjoyed it, and it's gonna help you on your own journey in Season 24. Personally, I'm very hyped for the season with the Ethereals, with especially the new inner rework that I like a lot, but also this LoD with Light is going to be a very fun speed meta, and I'm quite excited to try that and also push it to solo 150. That's going to be very fun. Hope you also going to have a lot of fun in the season. Hope you like this video, and see you guys next time.